a morte e a viagem para a imortalidade. (3.500 anos antes da era cristã e cerca de 2.500 anos antes dos profetas do Antigo Testamento, os antigos egípcios já ponderavam sobre a mais profunda e mística questão da existência humana.
All societies struggle with the greatest mystery of life, death. But few have approached death with greater directness or with such enormous respect, ceremony and ritual as the ancient Egyptians. For them, death was just one of a whole series of cycles. The Nile rose and fell, crops were planted and harvested, a person lived and died. But if you were properly prepared, the greatest cycle of all began after death.
Os egípcios, desde os primórdios de sua história, acreditavam fortemente na vida após a morte, uma existência que poderia continuar pela eternidade. Para estes povos antigos, a morte era uma simples transição.
In ancient Egypt, death was ever before the people, because to them it wasn't the great end that it is to us. It's simply a changing of state. And of course they're going to go on living, and their spirit, their life force, their personality is going to be able to transcend all the actual trauma of death and go on into the next life.
O conceito egípcio de vida eterna era de algum modo diferente das culturas cristãs, que se seguem nos séculos posteriores. Os egípcios não procuravam por uma vida melhor, um paraíso celestial após a morte. Eles simplesmente queriam a continuação da vida que eles tinham e amavam aqui na Terra. Uma enorme quantidade de energia era canalizada nos rituais que se faziam em prol da morte. E estudando esses rituais, os arqueólogos esperam não só descobrir como as pessoas morriam, mas também como viviam.
How do you deal with death? It's the old question. Archaeologists are still trying to find out how the ancient Egyptians answered it. We're picking our way through some rice paddies, here in the Nile Delta, on our way to an excavation of a very early burial site. It's Old Kingdom, 4,500 years ago. Dutch Egyptologist Willem van Haarlen is leading an international dig there. And if we don't break an axle as we go along, then we're almost there.
A maior parte do Egito é deserto e os corpos dos antigos egípcios foram preservados por milhares de anos. Mas as condições do delta do Nilo são bem diferentes. Aqui, os muitos braços do Nilo alimentaram um lençol de água que é bem próximo da superfície. A maioria das coisas enterradas no delta do Nilo se decompõem rapidamente. Me juntei a Willem van Haarlen, no antigo cemitério que ele está escavando na região do delta. Para arqueólogos como van Haarlen, este é um lugar muito frustrante para se pesquisar o passado. Mas eu tive sorte suficiente para chegar bem no dia em que um corpo estava sendo removido de sua tumba para estudo. Willem apresentou-me a Alexei Kohl, um especialista russo em ossos humanos.
So, Alexei, tell me what you have here. What sex is this skeleton?
We know that it was a male about 25, 35 years old, and we didn't observe any trace of disease on his bones.
So this was quite a healthy person?
Yes, quite healthy.
So here we have the legs, and this is the pelvis area?
Legs, pelvis, you can see arms here.
And the ribs? Here.
Yes, ribs, yes.
And this is the skull?
Yes, this is the skull, and you can see the jaw here, and
with
teeth.
the teeth?
and 13 beads.
How old is the skeleton?
Very broadly spoken, between 2500 and 2000 BC. So it's between 4000 and 4500 years old.
But even with this crude burial, there are offerings placed here which would suggest that even at this early stage there was a very strong sense of the afterlife and where this person was going after death.
Absolutely. These vessels probably contain some kind of foodstuff. In other burials we found fish bones in these vessels, so that may have been fish and in some way preserved, salted or something like that.
So you're going to be taking the bones out today and the offering jars, perhaps?
Yes. And if you want, you can help us by taking out some of the beads, for example.
That would be great, thank you.
Nenhum egípcio era enterrado sem alguma preparação para a vida que estava por vir. Este homem foi mandado para a eternidade com um colar. Eu consegui encontrar muitas contas de pedras deste colar que serão salvas para um futuro estudo.
There's the next one. How do you keep track of all these?
Well, we give this number 3 because there's a small one in between we haven't taken out yet.
Huh?
And then we put them in film boxes with the number written on it. So we can reconstruct the exact order according to the sketch I made.
You must have thousands of film boxes.
Yes, we have. They're very useful for taking samples and small finds and things like that. Yeah. Oh, well, there's...
Por mais que Van Harlen e seus colegas estejam aprendendo coisas sobre este homem de mais de 4.000 anos de idade, haverão outras coisas que nunca saberemos. Qual era o seu nome? O que ele fazia para ganhar a vida? O que nós podemos ter certeza é que ele esperava encontrar seu caminho para a vida eterna. Mas a transição do mundo dos vivos para a vida eterna no mundo dos mortos não era automática. Era um complexo e ritualizado evento que só poderia ser negociada com sucesso por aqueles que viveram uma vida moral. E mesmo estes têm que se preparar para superar muitos obstáculos. A passagem para outra vida ocorria em um lugar que os egípcios chamavam de submundo. E quem governava esta realidade misteriosa era o grande deus Osíris. O espírito da pessoa morta era pego diante de Osíris e uma corte de 42 outros juízes. Aqui faziam uma série de perguntas e charadas sobre sua vida. Responder corretamente a essas questões era vital para a conquista do pós-vida.
They had to pass a moral and ritual test before they could enter the afterlife. There was a judgment of their moral and ethical value. They then had to become empowered with magic in the afterlife so that they could defeat the many dangers which existed there.
A parte mais crítica do exame era conhecida como pesando o coração. Nesta cerimônia, o coração da pessoa era pesado e comparado a uma pena. Se o coração se equilibrasse com a pena, o candidato poderia passar. Com todos esses desafios, era natural que os antigos egípcios procurassem por ajuda.
While the physical body was being mummified and entombed, the spirit was undergoing its great journey through the underworld in the hope of being reborn in the afterlife. Now, there were maps, guides to this journey. They're commonly called the Book of the Dead, and it's parts of that you'll find on the walls of every tomb. They were directions, instructions to the departed spirit.
Sometimes these funerary texts go to the extent of either describing or even providing a map of what the afterlife is like and what are the routes through the afterlife. And that's very important because the routes are very dangerous to follow.
For those who failed the exhaustive examination for entrance into the afterlife, what awaited was every Egyptian's greatest nightmare. Those who were judged unworthy were cast into hellish pits and tortured. Those who failed the test were fed to the great beast, Amit, the eater of the dead. But for a people who so loved their land and the life it gave them, perhaps the greatest fear was the thought of spending eternity without their beloved Egypt.
As múmias sempre foram artefatos reverenciados. Durante a Idade Média, elas eram transformadas em pó para serem usadas como cura. A seguir, os mistérios da mumificação, das faixas à remoção das vísceras.
His name was Maseharti, general of the army, high priest of Amun-Re, and one of the sons of the pharaoh Pinedjem I. He suffered from severe headaches. We have some of the letters he wrote to his doctor asking for a cure. Well, maybe it didn't work, though he lived to the relatively advanced age of 52. But for all the details we know of his life, to the visitors to this museum, he is just a mummy. From the Greeks and Romans to the Hollywood screenwriters, no part of Egyptian life has more fascinated the world than mummification. And this is a very successful example, which means that as far as Maseharti is concerned, he is still alive.
A fascinação mundial pelas múmias não é um fenômeno recente. Napoleão já era intrigado pelas múmias quando ele invadiu o Egito em 1798. Os primeiros arqueólogos ficavam obsessos com esses corpos preservados. Depois do ouro, nada dominava mais os seus olhares. Mas no seu entusiasmo, eles não eram sempre cuidadosos no manejo dos mortos. O resultado era uma imperfeita compreensão do significado da mumificação e de como essa magnífica prática veio à tona. Os antigos egípcios acreditavam que nosso antigo Masaher poderia continuar com sua vida, mesmo após a morte, apenas se seu corpo ficasse preservado.
I think the fact that they did go to so much trouble makes it very clear that the actual body was going to have some continuing existence in the afterlife, and that they would be able to re-inhabit their body, and their body would be able to take on the form of a living being again.
Era imprescindível que o espírito da pessoa morta encontrasse seu corpo novamente, que era a base ou a casa do espírito. O corpo tinha de ser o máximo reconhecível. Nos primórdios da civilização egípcia, preservar o corpo era muito simples. Os mortos eram simplesmente enterrados em covas rasas, e o calor e a areia do deserto garantiam que os tecidos do corpo secariam antes mesmo que apodrecesse. Mas quanto mais o Egito se tornava sofisticado, as pessoas começavam a desejar uma tumba que fosse mais do que uma cova na areia.
By 3400 BC, upper-class Egyptians were being buried in tombs above the ground. But without a bed of dry sand, their bodies decomposed. What was needed was a better method of preservation, because without the body, there would be no chance of an afterlife. It took the best part of 1,000 years, but what evolved was a highly complex system of mummification.
Os métodos primitivos eram pouco mais do que envolver o corpo com linho e depois passar uma resina líquida. Mas com o passar do tempo ficou claro para os egípcios que, como todos os organismos, as partes internas do corpo eram as primeiras a se decompor. Pela quarta dinastia, em 2600 a.C., eles começaram a remover os órgãos e as verdadeiras múmias começaram a surgir. O processo se tornou cada vez mais sofisticado, até que se atingiu seu ápice no Novo Império, aproximadamente 1500 anos antes de Cristo.
Making a mummy began with evisceration. The brain came out in small pieces through the nose. The stomach, lungs, liver, and intestines were taken out through a small incision. Each of them was placed in a special canopic jar, just like these. These jars were then stored close to the mummy so that the spirit could recognize his or her spare parts.
Nem todos eram mumificados da mesma maneira. Como um carro sendo vendido com um banco de couro ou tecido normal, 6 ou 8 cilindros, familiares do morto no Antigo Egito poderiam escolher que tipo de múmia eles queriam.
Both the lower and the upper classes all hoped to preserve the body to the best of their abilities, but of course it was a matter of economics, so lower classes couldn't necessarily afford detailed mummification.
There were different levels of mummification in Egypt, even though most mummification was only available to the better off people anyway. But within that group, there were less expensive and more expensive means of doing it. And obviously for a pharaoh, he would have the very best processes available.
Para o faraó, era um processo minucioso que durava cerca de 40 dias. Os ingredientes mais especiais eram usados para ungir o corpo. Resinas de pinheiro e zimbro eram carregadas de onde se conhece hoje como Líbano. Incenso e mirra eram trazidos da Somália e Península Arábica. Usava-se também canela e cera de aveia para perfumar o cadáver e selar o corpo. Uma vez que o corpo estava preparado, era envolto em tiras de linho que cobriam até os dedos das mãos e pés. Enquanto os séculos se tornavam milênios, a busca pela múmia ideal continuava. O reconhecimento da múmia era tão importante que os egípcios buscavam qualquer técnica que pudesse manter a aparência da múmia. O grande faraó Ramsés II tinha como principal característica seu nariz grande e encurvado. Para preservar essa característica, era necessária uma inovação técnica. Radiografias feitas em 1977 revelaram que a cavidade nasal do faraó fora preenchida com dúzias de grãos de pimentas, para garantir que o legendário nariz pudesse ser reconhecido por toda a eternidade.
Kingdom, they had started inserting small onions under the eyelids because eyes are mainly water. So when you desiccate them, they all get sunken in. So for various of the royal mummies, we have small onions inserted in so that they have a nice naturalistic lump, so that it looks like they're just sleeping.
Pedras pintadas também substituíam os olhos. Serragem, palha e líquens eram utilizados por diversas vezes para moldar e preencher o rosto de forma a preservar a aparência. Nós não sabemos muito sobre as pessoas que embalsamavam os mortos, mas sabemos que o processo final de envolver a múmia era feito por sacerdotes vestindo máscaras do deus Anubis, a divindade responsável pela mumificação. Uma vez que a múmia do faraó estava envolta, era coberta com uma máscara funerária que tinha a aparência do faraó. A mais famosa destas máscaras é a que cobriu o rosto do jovem faraó do Novo Império, Tutankhamon. A maioria dos especialistas concordam que no tempo que os romanos dominaram o Egito, no primeiro século a.C., o padrão da mumificação já havia mudado. Embora a prática tenha se mantido com extrema importância para os egípcios, a qualidade dos trabalhos diminuiu.
There are, archaeological horror stories of unwrapping what looks like a perfectly viable mummy and finding that it's actually the parts of several bodies which have just been pushed together, but identified to the family as Mr. X or Mrs. Y, and given to them as the body to be buried, so that it looks like that embalming became a pretty sloppy process very often.
O que nunca mudou foi a crença de que as múmias tinham de ser identificáveis para os mortos. Estes maravilhosos retratos dos mortos eram pintados em cartazes e colocados na frente da múmia. O estilo parece romano, mas na verdade são as faces dos egípcios. Elas observam as eras na esperança de garantir seu desejo de passar a eternidade com seus deuses. Assim como evoluía o processo de mumificação, também evoluía o modo como os antigos egípcios enterravam seus entes queridos. Nos primórdios, eles eram enterrados na areia. E no tempo dos primeiros faraós, o conceito de morte e vida após evoluiu e eles já procuravam novas maneiras para enterrar os mortos.
Over 3,000 years before the Christian era, Egyptian attitudes towards burial began to change. Simple pits in the desert were no longer seen as adequate. What was needed was a more permanent, substantial home for the dead. A structure with space for all the things that the dead would need on his long journey through to the afterlife. And a space for offerings and food for his refreshment.
As tumbas desenvolvidas naquela época eram as mastabas, estruturas retangulares simples com uma única câmara funerária. Grupo de mastabas se tornaram uma cidade para os mortos. Conforme as práticas funerárias se tornaram mais complexas, as mastabas também evoluíram. Os egípcios acreditavam que quanto mais o morto era venerado e seu nome repetido, mais ele vivia. Foram feitas câmaras adicionais a essas mastabas, onde amigos e familiares poderiam homenagear o falecido e rezar por seu nome. Para os egípcios, o espírito do falecido retornava frequentemente para o corpo e se restabelecia. Assim, comida, água e até vinho eram trazidos para a mastaba para deleito do falecido.
Hundreds of mastabas were built here on the Giza Plateau. All around us are buried the high officials and attendants at the court of the pharaohs. Most of these tombs were excavated in the 1930s, but some remained hidden. Dr. Anne Roth of Howard University is leading a team here to explore this whole field of mastabas. They're trying to find the missing tombs and to learn more about the burial practices of the Old Kingdom.
Mastaba tombs, like the one I'm sitting on, were built in the Old Kingdom period and even earlier as sort of artificial mounds that would cover the body of the dead person. And we're coming back to some tombs that were excavated mostly in the late 1930s and trying to find out, by looking at them a little more carefully, if we can trace the activities of the people who built them and the people who owned them and the people who worked here as priests and the people who visited here as tourists, and really sort of reconstruct the life in the cemetery.
So this is one of the mastabas that you've been re-excavating?
Not this one, actually, the one over there. Brad spent a couple days clearing off where this mastaba had fallen down over this one, and immediately when he started clearing the actual surface of the mastaba itself, he found first one burial chamber and then another. And these are unusual because they don't seem to have shafts above them. We haven't quite figured out how they got into them. They may have actually buried the people and then built the whole mastaba over the top of them.
So Brad, hi, you've been busy.
Yes.
Tell me what you found here.
Well, when we first opened the chamber, there was the top of a skull, so we knew that there was a burial here. This one is apparently a rather young woman, perhaps somewhere around 18. And we can tell that from the way that the bones have not quite completely fused. As you grow, of course, bones change.
The burial here is only one of two burials that we think we've got in this tomb. We were looking for the shaft of that, and while we were looking for the shaft, we ran across a second one, which I think you're about ready to open, aren't you?
Yeah, I think so. This body is partially excavated, but in this other spot, we have probably a complete burial.
It's extraordinary. May we have a look?
Allison, we've got another body for you. Can you see anything down there?
I can see a skull. Would that be a tibia or a leg bone?
Yes, it's a leg bone.
What will you do now in order to uncover the skeleton?
Well, I'll do a lot of sweeping, trying to carefully not move the bones. The problem with these burials are, as you've noticed, it's a very small space.
Basically, it does look disturbed. Mm-hmm. It's
to say the least.
Possibly female. The bones are pretty small, clearly an adult.
All right, we'll have to dig it out and find out what it is, who it is. Great. Great, Mabruk. Another body. Excavating bodies is a sort of scary thing to do, actually, because they are people, and we have to remember they are people, and we try and treat them with a lot of respect. We had one body that was found with the hands underneath the head, and the head was resting, and the hands were resting on a little stone pillow. It tells you almost something about their personality, and there's a real sense of connection with these ancient people that were buried in these tombs.
This is the skull of a woman who died about 4,400 years ago. She was between 30 and 39 years old, probably about 35. And so dying at that age was not uncommon. She's been kind of interesting. She has an active dental abscess. The abscess, you can see it here. It's in her left first molar, and you see these two holes here. Probably very painful and possibly related to her death. It is possible to die from an untreated dental abscess. The Egyptians had a very high rate of tooth wear because they ground their grain on stone grindstones, and that put a lot of grit into the flour, and there's a lot of ambient dust. And so you can imagine that a lifetime of eating bread made that way, it's like chewing on sandpaper.
Através do seu trabalho, Anne Ruff e seus colegas podem estar oferecendo a essas pessoas da antiguidade a vida eterna que eles tanto procuravam.
We hope we make them live longer by studying them and telling something about their lives, because the ancient Egyptians believed that part of your soul was what other people thought of you. So by forming these human connections with these dead people again, we hope we're atoning for any disrespect that we may be showing to their bones.
Os ossos contidos nessas mastabas em Gizé pertencem aos comuns, pessoas de classe média. Mas mesmo para os faraós, a morte finalmente chegava. Os egípcios acreditavam que quando o seu rei morria, ele se juntava ao grande deus Ra, para sempre, carregando o sol sobre o céu em uma barca celestial. Para garantir que ele tivesse sua barca após sua partida para esta importante jornada, barcos como esses eram às vezes enterrados próximos às tumbas. Em primeiro lugar, este parece ser um lugar muito incomum para encontrar uma embarcação real, muito menos uma frota deles. Essas muralhas são tudo o que restou deste vasto complexo de templos mortuários. Eles foram construídos no deserto, próximo à antiga cidade de Abydos, para homenagear reis mortos que governaram há quase 5.000 anos atrás. Foi aqui, em 1991, Dr. David Connor, do Instituto de Belas Artes da Universidade de Nova York, fez uma importante descoberta. O primeiro de uma série de barcos enterrados bem ao lado de fora destas paredes. Novas descobertas têm sido feitas até este presente momento. Matthew Adams é o diretor associado do projeto. Ele explicou como esses antigos barcos foram encontrados.
We noticed initially in our work there were some very unusual walls poking up out of the sand just in this area. Let me show you.
I can see them, yes.
Initially we thought that these were the walls of some building. You can see the mud bricks here, and just a bit of the original plaster face of the wall. But they had these unusual shapes at the end. Here's a corner, and the end comes around and is curved, rounded.
So what was the answer to the mystery?
The answer to the mystery is that these walls were built to contain wooden boats. The boats were placed in a small pit, then the brickwork was built up against the outside. Each one of the boats inside these structures is filled with mud brick, and then the whole thing was capped off with a nice mud plaster.
And they're actually in there now, those wooden boats?
There are wooden boats inside these structures right now.
And what's the boulder?
The boulder, we think, is some kind of symbolic anchor to permanently or eternally moor the boats in place.
It's amazing. So what you have here is walls surrounding an actual wooden boat, and this is the prow or the stern of the boat?
We're not quite sure whether it's the prow or the stern, which end is the front or the back.
Clear shape though, isn't it?
Very clear, yes.
How long is it altogether?
The longest is about 90 feet by about 10 or 12 feet wide.
90 feet?
90 feet.
These would be substantial things, wouldn't they?
Very substantial craft.
É um grande trabalho escavar as toneladas de areia que cobrem esses barcos. Depois disso, a massa é lentamente removida para que possa saber como era a aparência do barco. conforme a areia é removida, é possível revelar cuidadosamente as tábuas de madeira das longas e esguias embarcações, aqui colocadas há quase 5.000 anos.
Wow, look at that. Here you actually see a number of the longitudinal planks which ran the length of the boat. You can see the spaces between them.
So these planks seem to be really thick here.
That's right. They're about between 2 and 3 inches thick, and we're not quite sure about the length yet. We don't have enough exposed.
And what wood is this?
It seems to be cedar wood from modern Lebanon.
It's 1,000 miles away.
That's right.
So the shape of it, this will be the bottom of the hull, and then the hull would come up like this. And what's this here?
This is the actual wood that's left along the sides of the hull.
And these holes, is it this insects eating these holes? Or what?
No, these are actual holes that were cut in the wood when the boat was constructed for the rope lashings that held the planks together. They were woven through here. Here's a set, here's another one here.
Debbie, what exactly are you doing there? What are you using on that wood to keep it?
Well, after the wood is exposed, we consolidate it immediately using an acrylic resin. And this is to help hold it together, to protect it from drying out more.
And what's that along the side there?
On the side we have some yellow pigment. You can see it here, running along here.
So this would be a painted boat like you see on all those tomb reliefs?
That's right.
And what are you going to do with it now?
Well, when we finish strengthening the wood, we intend to take the pieces out one by one for more detailed study.
But there are 12 of these boats.
That's right. We're only dealing with this one now. And we thought for many years that there were only 12, but we got a surprise just a few days ago. Let me show you.
So you knew that there were 12 boats here?
That's right. And just behind you, you see boat number 12. And until just 2 days ago, I would have sworn that there were no more than 12. But then our excavations this year showed this line of brickwork coming up, and this is boat number 13.
But, I mean, there could be lots more of these. You could have hundreds of boats stretched right the way along the desert here.
It's possible, yes.
Basically, what you have here is an ancient marina complex.
We have a royal fleet moored in the desert.
Segredos do Egito ainda estão sendo revelados. Pouco depois de eu ter partido de Ábidos, um 14º barco foi encontrado. Juntos, são os mais antigos do mundo. Esta frota real de barcos que Matthew Adams e seus colegas estão tentando salvar localizam-se próximas às mastabas dos primeiros reis. Após séculos usando simples mastabas, o funeral havia se tornado mais complexo. E aproximadamente 2.700 anos antes de Cristo, os reis egípcios estavam prontos para construir tumbas em uma escala ainda maior. Egito é um paraíso para as múmias. Partes do Vale do Nilo recebem menos de 1 milímetro de chuva ao ano. Temperaturas ultrapassam a casa dos 50 graus Celsius. Foram estas condições que favoreceram a preservação das covas. A seguir, o Vale das Múmias Douradas, em Egito, além das pirâmides.
For centuries, the mastaba had fulfilled the needs of the dead. But as the Old Kingdom flourished, Egypt reached a peak of prosperity. Now the living pharaohs required something more. Not just a tomb, but a monument to their own greatness.
Cerca de 2.600 anos antes da era cristã, os faraós do Egito criaram as maiores tumbas que o mundo já viu. Enormes compartimentos com mais de 2,5 milhões de blocos de pedra calcária, cada uma pesando 2,5 toneladas. Começando no Antigo Império, as pirâmides serviam como local de descanso final para os faraós por mais de 900 anos. Mas estes grandes mausoléus consumiam uma enormidade de recursos. A construção das pirâmides, mesmo as mais pequenas, sugou a economia egípcia. Mesmo quando estavam enterrados nas profundezas das pirâmides, as tumbas dos faraós não estavam seguras dos ladrões que as sucessivamente saqueavam. Ao final do Antigo Império, a realeza do Antigo Egito procurava por um outro lugar onde os mortos pudessem descansar para sua longa e difícil jornada no pós-vida.
By the start of the New Kingdom, around 1570 BC, there was a change in religious observance. At the same time, it had become clear that the mastaba tombs, even the Great Pyramids, were not going to be safe from the ravages of the tomb robbers. So, Egypt's rulers began to look for a more secure site for the tombs of their great one. They chose this barren valley near Thebes. Pharaohs were carried here to begin their eternal lives, in the place that is now known as the Valley of the Kings.
O remoto isolamento do vale parecia prover a segurança necessária. As construções da tumba do faraó aqui começavam, normalmente logo que ele assumia o trono. Alguns trabalhadores escavavam grandes câmaras na pedra calcária das montanhas. Outros cobriam as paredes com magníficos trabalhos em relevo e pinturas. E ainda outros faziam as inscrições propícias na tumba para assegurar uma bem-sucedida passagem no submundo. Textos antigos revelam que quando chegava a notícia de que o rei havia morrido, a decoração final era rapidamente concluída na tumba que esperava o rei. Após a mumificação, o corpo do faraó era carregado pelo Nilo a barco. Então, uma procissão com muitos sacerdotes e penitentes acompanhavam a múmia enquanto ela prosseguia pelo empoeirado vale até sua tumba.
It would have taken many days of ritual and ceremony to bring the mummified body of the pharaoh from the banks of the Nile here to the entrance of the tomb. Since the day the pharaoh died, there will be frenetic activity preparing this place. Now at last, the final act of the king's life would begin. The smell of incense and the sound of chants would fill the air. Priests would lead the procession into the tomb, followed by the mourning royal family. At last, the procession reached this place, the burial chamber deep within the tomb. The mummy was lowered into its waiting sarcophagus, final ritual prayers were chanted, and the heavy lid was moved into place. The mourners returned to the land of the living, and the pharaoh was left in his new home for the afterlife.
Por mais de 5 séculos, os faraós do Novo Império enterrados neste vale governaram o Egito em seu momento de grandeza e influência. Mas 1000 anos antes da era cristã, o poder do Egito e de seus reis começou a diminuir. Outras civilizações mais fortes tomaram o Egito e ocuparam seu território. Persas, gregos, helênicos e finalmente os romanos controlaram a terra dos faraós. Surpreendentemente, nenhum desses invasores impôs a sua religião. Os egípcios continuaram a adorar seus deuses, e as relações com a morte se mantiveram imutáveis, fato dramaticamente descoberto recentemente.
We're in Egypt's great western desert, some 200 miles west of Cairo. It's not a place for a flat tire. It's over 100 degrees out there. Driving across this place, it seems impossible to believe there's anything between here and the Libyan border except heat and lots of rock and sand. That's not quite true. There are certain places where depressions in the desert floor make it possible to reach down and tap vast supplies of water. The result is 5 lush oases. We're driving towards one now, Bahariya, where the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass is overseeing work on an incredible discovery.
Quando o Egito era parte do Império Romano, o vasto oásis de Bahariya era uma agitada comunidade com mais de 10.000 pessoas. O oásis era famoso por sua tâmara e vinho. Hoje é famoso por um acidente de burro.
In 1996, a workman was riding his donkey here in the Bahariya oasis. Suddenly, the animal's leg broke through the crust of the desert floor. There was a hole. He looked in it, and there were mummies, lots of them. They were the first of what may prove to be the greatest cache of mummies ever found.
Quase 4.000 anos depois do ritual de mumificação ter começado, estas múmias pareciam um pouco diferente das primeiras. A maioria não tinha caixão. Ao invés disso, seu rosto era coberto com uma máscara feita de um material semelhante a papel machê, mas é na verdade linho e papiro. Mas a importância que os egípcios tinham em preservar o corpo para o pós-vida permanecia imutável. Foi o papiro com linho dourado que conferiu a este lugar o seu nome, o Vale das Múmias Douradas. Dr. Zahi Hawass, do Supremo Conselho Egípcio das Antiguidades, está encarregado na escavação dessas tumbas. Ele me guiou por um passeio para conhecer o trabalho que tem sido feito até agora.
So, Doctor, which tomb is this?
This is the latest tomb that we discovered here in the Valley of the Golden Mummies. In this tomb only, we discovered 41 mummies.
There's an amazing number of
is.
mummies here. I've never seen so many mummies.
Yeah, but what's interesting that if you look at this type of mummies here, you can see at least 3 different types of mummies. If you look at the one that has a face that covered with gold, and this is the mummy that completely wrapped with linen only.
It's beautiful, isn't it, the way that's done?
Yes.
It's extraordinary work.
And this mummy, what's we call covered with cartonnage. And you can see here the scenes of gods and goddesses on them. And look at this, a child. We took one child like this for X-ray. But this is, I believe, a child within the age of maybe you can say 2 years maximum. And
this is beautiful.
It is, and it is in a very good condition. This is why I'm telling you that it is wrong that the people should say that the mummification in the Roman period was deteriorated. That's not true. It is in a very good condition, and I believe that this mummy in the middle here, that this man could be the head of the house.
Oh, that's why he's in the middle, like
the head of the family, because he's buried in the center of the room. And they put him in a kind of a high level of a stage, and this is why I believe that he's the head of the whole family.
It's very moving that a family should be buried together like this.
Exactly.
Is it the same in the other tombs?
Each mummy is different from the other mummy, and each mummy tells us a story about the people. And let us go.
Into another tomb.
Yeah.
How many of them are there that you've found so far?
We found in all the tombs until now 207 mummies.
207 mummies.
In this section here, if you look at this mummy, really, you know how they inlaid the eyes here?
Oh, that's remarkable.
Yeah, it's very beautiful, really, with the gold and the cartonnage.
Would this have been a richer person than most of them?
This is any mummy that you have gold on it means that this man was rich enough.
And this one's plaster, isn't it?
Yes, but this is, I believe, was a bride. She died before she get married.
Oh, I see.
And I believe that her family put the makeup on the lips and on these sides, and then she can get married in the afterlife.
And how many more tombs like this do you think you're going to find here?
I believe that I will spend all my life excavating, revealing secrets from the mummies, and revealing lots of stories about the life of the people here. And I said many times that at least we'll discover 10,000 mummies, and I call it the Valley of the Golden Mummies.
É fácil de se pensar que o ato de mumificação fosse apenas para os faraós. Foram as suas tumbas que atraíram toda a atenção dos arqueólogos. Mas as tumbas em Barra Hira estão repletas não com a realeza, mas com as pessoas comuns. Um pai enterrado com seu filho em seu peito. Uma mulher olhando para a múmia do homem que ela amava. Isto nos lembra que também os cidadãos comuns do Antigo Egito conseguiam enganar a morte evitando a degradação do corpo. Por mais de 4.000 anos, a mumificação era uma parte importante da família egípcia.
The Egyptian family's pain at the death of a loved one was just as real as ours would be. And even while they grieved, they knew that the deceased was at that very moment struggling to survive their great journey through the underworld. Meanwhile, the family had to embark on a long series of rituals and celebrations. The body itself must be mummified to receive the spirit after death. For every family, this was a huge effort and expense. Why did they do it? This was not some morbid obsession. They did it because they cared so much. Mummification was a huge act of love. They absolutely believed that death was not the end of life, but the beginning of eternity.